Hi, I'm Joe Stark, creator of the fantasy adventure series The Unscarred. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Now, on to the show.
On the world of Faereyas, a god made flesh is born every 500 years. These beings are known as the Chosen, but the world will come to call one of them the Unscarred. The Unscarred, written by Joe Stark.
Chapter 2 Fight and Flight. The Ka warriors relaxed around the fire while a lone sentry stood guard. The sun had begun to wane, painting the mountains to the east in golden alpenglow. The sounds in the forest around them had begun to change as the early rising nocturnal creatures began to stir. Night fell quickly among the dense boughs, blanketing the Ka camp in a veil of darkness. The flickering flames of the nearby fire sent shadows dancing among the trees. The two prisoners were hardly noticed as they quietly conversed. "That was the first life I'd taken," said Eric. "At the time I acted without thought, but it haunted me. I could have stopped them without taking Dwyne's life. My anger was replaced with remorse." Hoke nodded. "So you fled?" Eric shook his head. "No, I left of my own choosing. I felt drawn here." Hoke quietly laughed. "Ha! Drawn to this?" He shook his head. "Mate, you're tied to a fucking tree. How exactly is one given such a shit hand?" Eric leaned his head against the tree and looked upward. "I've come to learn that it's not so much the how as it is the why. After the fight, I sat in my room and played it over in my head. I could remember every detail, every bit of terrible pain I'd dealt. My solitude was interrupted by the arrival of Ander the Counselor, the Father Abbot of the Creator's Abbey on the Isle of Divinity, and High Priest of the Order of the Creator, the sixth chosen. Before. Eric sat in his room meditating, attempting to put a semblance of order to the chaos raging within his mind. A soft knock abruptly roused him from his misery. Gracefully coming to his feet, he hesitantly opened the door. Seeing the Father Abbot outside suddenly filled him with a sense of foreboding. "Father Abbot," intoned Eric in greeting, bowing deeply to hide his unease. "Eric," said Ander kindly, "may I come in?" Ander appeared to be in his mid-70s, but it was said that he was over 500 years old. He stood 6 feet tall and had a bald head with a short white beard. His golden-hued skin made his teeth appear brilliant white as he smiled and surveyed Eric with his piercing blue eyes. "Yes," answered Eric, quickly stepping aside to allow him entrance. Ander removed his hands from the voluminous sleeves of his dark brown robe and patted Eric on the shoulder as he stepped past, allowing the young man to close the door behind him. As Eric closed the door, he noticed several heads peeking out of doorways looking in his direction. Eric narrowed his eyes and the voyeurs quickly disappeared. Swallowing a sudden rush of anger, he re-entered his room. "We haven't spoken more than a few words in passing during your time here on the island, Eric. For that I apologize," said Ander. "Know that what happened today was out of your control, but such is life. Our plans mean little in the grand schemes of the Creator." Eric nodded in understanding, and Ander continued. "We have much in common, the two of us, though my life began much differently. I was discovered young and trained from an early age, while you, Eric, essentially raised yourself, an orphan from the gutters of Lant, taken in by Brother Jerome when you were 12 years old. Different origins aside, we were both denied our childhood. My own taken by design and yours by fate. A terrible crime, don't you think? Asked Ander. Eric felt a fresh wave of anger flow over him. Yes, we both know I am only here because I had nowhere else to go, said Eric quietly. Ander pondered for a moment before nodding in agreement. A simplistic viewpoint, but accurate nonetheless. You took me in and trained me in your ways, replied Eric. I meant no rudeness, Father Abbot. Ah, we attempted to train you, Eric, but your unusual grasp of spellcraft and your quick mastery of the art baffled and astonished your teachers. Because of this, your training has been chaotic. All factors considered, it is only natural that you would fall back upon your baser instincts of survival. But what happened today, began Eric, was unfortunate for your circumstances, finished Ander. My circumstances, echoed Eric bitterly. What was previously suspicion is now confirmed, said Ander. You are of the Chosen. Eric balked at the suggestion, but Ander held up a hand as though pleading for patience. Eric was soon horrified as Ander drew a blade across his palm, leaving a bloody gash in the skin. Eric's horror was replaced by astonishment as he watched the wound pull itself closed. What? Began Eric, but Ander quickly closed the distance between them and brought the knife down in a slash, cutting Eric from his left shoulder to his right hip. Eric screamed as he fell backwards. His hands clutched at the wound in a futile attempt to staunch the flow of blood gushing from his body. What? Asked Eric as he ran his hands over his chest. Aside from the blood in his slashed clothing, he found no sign of the injury. Ander stood over him and smiled as he offered the young man a hand. Eric groaned as he sat up, assisted by Ander. His body was slowly beginning to feel normal again, the pain of the cut a fading memory. Do you understand now? Asked Ander. You are of the Chosen, Eric. In time you will understand the full extent of your capabilities, coming to know death only as a companion, our true curse. Eric's mind reeled. The Chosen were heirs to the power that the Creator had bestowed upon St. Ian thousands of years before. He'd always been different, able to do things that couldn't be explained, but before coming to the island, he hadn't truly known what the Chosen were. It was like learning a story and during the telling becoming a part of it. Ander looked into Eric's eyes. What are your thoughts in all of this? Eric turned and looked out of his window. I have to leave. I have this desire to go west, like I'm being called or pulled. It's confusing, said the young Chosen. Far to the west, beyond the looming mountains, was the world without, the ancient world, the world that had been left behind after the great dream. It called to him. Ander placed his hand upon Eric's shoulder. It was and still is my belief that everything happened in this way for a reason. I've been the Father Abbot here on the Isle of Divinity for almost 5 centuries, said Ander, his voice weary. I felt the moment of your birth, the moment the power left James and was bestowed upon you. We knew you were born, but we knew not where to find you. And so it was you that found us. Now fate has seen fit to take you away from this island much sooner than I had anticipated. There is still so much you do not know, but you're clearly meant to go on without the education I had planned for you. This must be the way. If you feel drawn west, then I bid you to follow that feeling, Eric. Let it guide you, said Ander. Eric nodded. The feeling in his chest was tangible, as though invisible chains were tugging at him, bidding him to cross the sea and the mountains beyond, to step into the ancient world. Now. The pain was real, said Eric, but it quickly fled as the wound began to heal, replacing my misery with wonder. The last shred of doubt had left my mind in that moment, and I understood that I truly was of the Chosen. Hoke looked skeptical. Well, that's... The sound of clashing steel suddenly echoed through the woods, cutting short Hoke's reply as he nervously glanced around the camp. Oh shit, said Hoke as the sounds of battle grew closer. Of course it's probably them, he hissed to himself. Probably who? Asked Eric. I was pursued by a different band of Ka before I ran into this mess. They're as tenacious as they are unfriendly, said Hoke. A Ka warrior in bright red armor stepped out of the tree line near the edge of the camp. He held a bloody sword and smiled grimly as he spotted Eric and Hoke tied to the tree. Hoke began to furiously yank at the rope bindings. Come on, yelled Hoke as he lashed about in futility. The Ka laughed as he stalked forward. Ha! I should have thanked those dogs instead of killing them. Hoke dropped his arms in defeat and shouted, Hawk! This might be a good time. The Ka ignored Hoke's screams and pointed his sword. Your head is a trophy beyond compare. He stalked forward, intent upon claiming his bloody prize. Hundreds of miles away, along the eastern coast of Faereyas, stood an edifice beyond compare, the Tower of Terransay. Raised thousands of years before, its creation was shrouded in myth. Traditionally, the tower stood as the command center for the eastern reaches of the Faeryn kingdom, but the days of Faeryn glory were as faded as the southern ramparts. Centuries before, after the death of King Thenin in the Battle of Caras-Fawn, the Faeryns had split into warring houses that carried an uneasy truce, only occasionally shaken by minor border disputes. But the denizens of the tower remained free of reproach. Rising hundreds of feet higher than the immense monolith it was built upon, the fortress was both impregnable and imposing as it commanded a view for hundreds of miles in every direction. Descended from the great houses of Faeryn mages, the people of Terransay were the true force to be feared. One such descendant had suddenly jumped from her chair, the dusty tome on Ka history completely forgotten upon her desk as she stared intently into the empty space of the immense room around her. The space was utilitarian in nature, with little in the way of creature comforts. A small desk and bookshelf were tucked into a corner next to a roaring fireplace. The center of the room gave way to a wooden practice circle. Along the far wall stood a weapons rack bristling with blades of varying length. The woman was tall, easily 6 inches past 6 feet in height. She looked to be in her mid-20s in age, with a muscular athletic build and golden-toned skin. She wore black boots, black leggings, and a light gray sweater. Her reddish-golden hair was done back in a tightly bound ponytail, which whipped back and forth like the tail of an agitated cat as she gritted her teeth and raced across the room. Pulling a slender longsword from the rack, she spun and narrowed her eyes, staring at the empty room before her. A man appeared in the doorway holding a small pile of books. "Hawk," he called out. Seeing the sword in her hand and the fierce expression on her face, he placed the books on the desk and quietly exited the room. Clearly, her mind was elsewhere. Eric watched as the Ka warrior drew nearer. He parted his wrists and the rope bindings easily tore apart, falling to his feet. Holding up his hands, he stepped between Hoke and the approaching warrior's upraised sword. "Lower your sword and walk away," said Eric, evenly measuring his words. The approaching warrior paused as though considering Eric's words. He lowered his sword and halted his advance. Eric sighed in relief and glanced over his shoulder at Hoke. "Maybe we can—" The Ka swiftly stepped forward, running Eric through with his sword. The bloody point stuck out of Eric's back at an upward angle. Eric's mouth opened in a scream as the Ka grimly looked into his eyes. Hoke stood rooted in shock, unable to tear his eyes away from the horror unfolding before him. Hundreds of miles away, in Terransay, Hawk watched as well, her face a mirror image to the horror evident upon Hoke's visage. Eric's face twisted in anger as his left hand shot forward, catching the Ka warrior by his shoulder and holding him in a firm grasp. With his other hand he grasped the blade of the sword sticking out of his chest. Eric gave a primal scream as he pulled the blade free from his body. His vision turned white as his mind reeled from the pain. He scarcely heard the Ka's scream of horror as he drove the sword through the warrior's armor, cracking the chitinous breastplate as though it were glass. As the Ka fell limp in his grasp, visions flooded Eric's mind. A Ka village, log homes with thatched roofs, children playing, people working. It was an idyllic scene. The vision turned. The village was burning. Faeryn soldiers raced through the village on horseback, indiscriminately cutting down the Ka as they fled for their lives. Eric's eyes opened wide. His mind reeled from the brief psychic connection he'd experienced with the Ka as the man died in his grasp. He looked to Hoke. "Faeryn soldiers are slaughtering Ka villages under a black standard emblazoned with a crimson skull. This man believed us to be captured soldiers." Once again the sounds of battle rang through the forest, this time further away from the now quiet camp. "Your wound," said Hoke. His voice trailed off as he grimaced and hissed to himself. "Well, yes, it certainly seems so, doesn't it?" Eric searched through a small stack of goods piled alongside a Ka tent. He tossed Hoke a bundle with a steel longsword and an exquisitely crafted leather scabbard, clearly the blade that Hoke had worn before being captured. Eric hefted his staff and placed it over his shoulder. "We have to get out of here," said Eric, placing his hand on the Faeryn. Hoke lurched as the ground shifted and fell away, only to rise again as quickly as it had fled. Before he could speak, their surroundings shifted and changed. Hoke shook his head, his face pale, his eyes wide in shock. That's not possible. What you just did... Where are we? Asked Hoke. I don't know what I did, said Eric. He looked around for a moment. Wait, I know this place. This is the cave that I sheltered in last night. It's safe and it's a fair distance away from our captors. I don't know, I must have moved us here. I just knew we needed to get out of there to somewhere safe. Hoke raised a finger, turned, and walked a short distance away. Fuck me, maybe he is, he whispered furiously to himself as he paced back and forth. Then you fucking explain how that just happened, he hissed. I know you saw it too. All right, fine. Eric made to speak, but was held to silence as Hoke settled into a seated position on the floor of the cave and closed his eyes. Eric nodded to himself and quickly set about preparing a fire. In short order, he had a small blaze burning brightly within the shelter of the cave. The smoke lazily drifted upward before catching a draft that drew it back into the inky depths of the cave as though the mountain itself was inhaling the smoke. Eric's mind rolled over the events of the evening again and again. He couldn't escape the visions he'd seen, the memories from the dead Ka, the man he'd killed. He shook his head. No, he thought to himself. If he hadn't acted, Hoke would be dead. The Farron was still seated a short distance away. His eyes were closed and his breathing was even. Eric suspected that Hoke was just as busy processing the events of the night. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, share, and leave a 5-star review for the show. If you would like a copy of the Unscarred, please see the Amazon link in the show notes. Hardcover, paperback, and digital copies are all available right now. And if you want to email the show, hit me up at erictheunscarred@gmail.com.